Chapter 1. The noise of the Heford Engineered Products construction yard was so loud that at first Quint didn't realize that his manager Jamie was yelling for his attention. The grizzled man had resorted to waving wildly when shouting hadn't worked. Quint set the beam of treated wood down to the side and walked around the assembly line where the wooden sheets were measured, cut, and attached to the beams, taking shape into the walls of the houses of which they were destined to be a part in a few days. He tightened the strip of old blue shirt that he used as a sweatband around his head and used his handkerchief from his back pocket to wipe the sweat from the sides of his face. The summer months were his least favorite months of the year, simply because of the heat and how miserable it made working outside feel. Even though the assembly line was technically inside a building, the two huge doors that made up the wall on the front and back end were always open, and there was no air conditioning inside the building. Shed was a better word for it. The manager's office was a tiny room basically stuck onto the side of the shed, an addition that had been built onto the structure later. Quint could remember the day it had gone up 5 years before, when he had started working there. The majority of the workers were envious of the fact that this one tiny room was air-conditioned, but Jamie, ever the compassionate manager, vowed that the men would be allowed to take their 2 10-minute rest breaks in his office until he could convince the senior managers to build them their own air-conditioned break room, just like the other 3 sheds had for their workers. There was barely enough room for the desk chair, the trash can, and the old computer that Quint swore was older than the company itself, and had likely been purchased from someone in ancient Mesopotamia. The only other spots that were open were the space right in front of the desk and the space right beside the desk, and this was where Quint stood when Jamie entered. To Quint's surprise, Jamie was accompanied by Philip, one of Quint's co-workers on the assembly line. Quint had been around for some time, a few years more than Quint, and there was a general assumption among the rest of the crew that the two were competitors for a promotion to a better paid job in one of the other buildings. There was also a general assumption that Quint would be promoted instead of Philip, because it was widely suspected by many workers, some of them even said they knew for sure, that Philip was using his position to deal illegal drugs to his co-workers. One former employee who had been caught with paraphernalia had blamed Philip, but for whatever reason it had not been fully investigated by the managers, and so Philip got off clean. So when Quint entered Jamie's office and saw Philip standing next to the desk, he was immediately suspicious. "Quint, thanks for coming so soon," Jamie said sarcastically, but with a good-natured grin. "Sorry," Quint replied, smiling himself. "Couldn't hear you." "That's all right," Jamie said. "Quint, I'll get right to the point so you can get back to work, but you and Philip are both being considered for a promotion, as you know." Quint nodded and looked at Philip. He tried to be polite and smiled at him cordially, but Philip's constant scowl deepened, and Quint could sense the animosity coming from him. "Now, I didn't call you here so you could fight it out or nothing, but I've been hearing things lately coming from some of the other workers, and I know that you shoot straight, Quint. I want you to know that if you give me the honest truth, whether or not you get promoted has nothing to do with it." Quint and Philip both eyed each other, and Quint began to feel very uncomfortable. "I usually don't do this, but since both of you know that you might be promoted, it would be terrible if you tried to use this against him, Quint, but I want you to tell me what you've heard about him, about the drugs." Philip's top lip curled into a sneer. "Why don't you just hand him the job already? He gonna say whatever he has to say to get it?" "I told you to keep your mouth shut," Jamie said, glaring at Philip from beneath the brim of his baseball cap. "Quint, go ahead." Quint took a moment to compose himself, looking at Philip and searching his honest memory, then began very carefully. "Well, I honestly don't know any more than what I've heard from some of the other guys," he said. "They say he's dealing drugs, don't know what kind, but the reputation is that if you want to get high, you go to Philip. But it's just hearsay, so I never put much stock in it after he got off clean that one time." "Who's saying this about Philip?" "Most of the guys," Quint confessed. "Ryan, Jesse, Frank, Big Mike, pretty much everyone in our building." "But you don't believe it?" Jamie wanted to know. Quint could feel Philip's eyes on him. "I don't know for sure," Quint said with finality. "He was accused and let go while the other guys were put away. Could be either one as far as I know, but I have no first-hand knowledge of anything having to do with Philip or drugs." Philip seemed to relax a little and looked slightly surprised, as if he'd totally expected Quint to accuse him and seal the deal right there. "So if you were character witness for Philip, what would you say?" Jamie wanted to know. Quint wanted to tell the truth delicately, but it came out more quickly than he intended. "Oh, I don't like him much myself," he admitted. "He can be a real jerk sometimes, and he swears too much for my liking. I wouldn't bring my children around him, if I had any." Philip's glare resumed, and Jamie sat back in his chair as if he'd heard what he wanted to hear. Quint suddenly suspected that Jamie was attempting to use Quint's testimony to besmirch Philip so that Quint would get the promotion, and he was immediately indignant. He wanted the better job, but not if it meant he had to trash someone else's reputation to get there. Not that Philip's reputation was all that clean in the first place. He was a morally bankrupt person. But fair was fair. He was innocent of the drug charges, so Quint was not going to heap more on top of him just to be unjustly rewarded. Before Jamie could speak, Quint quickly added more to his statement. "But to me, that has nothing to do with whether or not he's guilty of dealing drugs. Plenty of people are jerks, but it doesn't mean they're druggies. If he's not in any sort of actual trouble, then I don't see how I have anything else to say about it. He can get the job, or I can. Simple as that. May the best man win, I guess." Jamie's eyes were intensely focused on Quint, who waited uncomfortably for him to say something. It wasn't like Jamie to make any sort of unfair move against any of his employees, but Quint was sure that Jamie was one of the ones who suspected Philip of being a druggie and would rather have had him fired the first time. Quint looked over at Philip, who was staring at the floor with his arms crossed, leaning against the wall, his mouth tightly closed. Quint could almost hear his teeth grinding behind his lips, and his nostrils were flared. He was furious. "Well, all right, Quint, that helps," Jamie said with a sigh. Quint could tell he was exasperated, but was trying not to show it. "I'll call my bosses and tell them they can do what they want with all this. You both can go back to work now." It was the end of the shift, and Quint had volunteered to stay late to inspect and secure the newly built walls that had been barely finished before the bell had rung. Quint refused to be unhappy with his coworkers, but they were often in such a rush to clock out and get home that they routinely left things half done, or not done at all. Typically, it took him about 10 minutes to go around the shed and pick up all the tools that had been left lying around, something that would have gotten them in serious trouble if an inspection ever happened after hours. Then it was 10 more minutes to sweep up, and anywhere from 5 minutes to 15 inspecting the walls that were still sitting in some fashion on the assembly line. This particular evening, one of the walls had been removed from the line and was still hanging from the crane they used to stack the walls onto the truck for transport. "Ooh, that's a big no-no," Quint said to himself, walking over toward it. The crane was not all that large, just big enough to lift the walls from the assembly line and stack them on the concrete floor about 5 or 6 feet away. The crew had had their share of mishaps with the crane, some minor, some resulting in major injuries. The most serious one had been 4 years before, when one of the metal bands around the wall had snapped, causing the whole thing to slip out to one side, where it came down and crushed the leg of a passing worker. The damage was severe. All 3 main bones in his leg were broken to some degree, but the femur had taken the worst of it. If the ambulance had arrived even just a single minute later than it did, poor Jeff would have bled to death, or at the very least lost his leg. But what no one else knew was that Quint, the perfect employee, the one who always did things by the book, had experienced his own traumatic incident with the crane. It hadn't been that long ago, either. It was shortly before what had happened to Jeff that Quint had stayed over one night he and everyone else had already clocked out, like tonight, that he had spotted a stray set of bolt cutters beneath a wall that was hanging in the air exactly like this one. If Jamie had seen him slip beneath the hanging wall to get them, he would have been lucky if he hadn't been fired. He had broken cardinal rule number 1 at Heford Engineered Products. Never, ever, ever go under something hanging from a crane. Ever. What the heck, he had thought back then. No one's here. The thing isn't moving. If it hasn't fallen by now, what's the chance it'll fall during the 3 seconds I'm scooting underneath it? Whether by divine providence or some other force of the universe, the chances that night were apparently something like 100%. So when Quint saw the hammer and box of nails underneath the hanging wall this second time, he vividly remembered that night 4 years ago and what he had discovered about himself back then. Without any fear of consequences, he ducked beneath the hanging wall and reached for the hammer and nail box, squatting to pick them up. He thought he heard a latch click, or some familiar sound, and realized a split second later that it was the sound of the lever for the crane release being pulled. That's when the entire wall came crashing straight down on him. He lay there, flat on his back, feeling the cool, smooth concrete beneath him and the rough texture of the wood paneling against his face and chest. He felt the after effects of the blow, the incredible weight and force of it, and he breathed it in, feeling his muscles bulge as the scent of his adrenaline mingled with the scent of sawdust. He lay there willingly, feeling the wall on top of him and admiring how something that should have been crushing the life out of him felt more like when he was little and his father had put a pillow on his stomach and then laid his head down on top of it. Except this was different. This time the impact woke him up, made him more aware, sharpened his senses, and, most importantly, it made him stronger than any human could ever be. After enjoying the sensation for a little bit, Quint remembered the sound he had heard before the impact. The lever for the crane release had been pulled, which meant that someone had pulled it while he was under there. Someone had tried to kill him. Quint took in a deep breath and felt his newly acquired strength surging through his veins. He put both hands on the wall and pushed up. It was like getting up from underneath a pile of folded towels. He simply pushed up and stood up, pushing the wall up and holding it above his head. He was not surprised to see Philip standing there, but Philip was sure surprised to see him. The scrawny man with the tattoos stood there, still halfway through the process of wiping his hand on his shirt to clean off the grease he had got on it from touching the crane release switch. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open, and he stood in an awkward half-walking, half-stopped-walking pose that made him look like he would trip over his own feet and fall the next time he tried to move. "Still mad, Philip?" Quint asked, taking care to set the wall down so as not to damage it. He gripped a little too hard, creating slight indents in the wooden beams, and realized that the impact had made him stronger than he thought. Philip was still gaping at him, terror on his face. You just... Quint sighed. Philip had seen it for himself now. He must have thought he was delusional, and hopefully that would help Quint's secret stay secret. He moved faster than Philip could possibly react. The strength in him made him stronger, but it made him faster also. Everything about him was enhanced through his power. His strength, his speed, his reaction times, his senses of smell, vision, hearing, all of it. Before Philip could even react, Quint was on him. He grabbed him under the arms and tossed him over to where the wall was so that the skinny man landed on top of it. Quint saw something go flying out of his shirt pocket when he landed, a small group of white objects that scattered across the floor. He couldn't believe his eyes. Joints. Philip had been getting a high when he had tried to kill Quint. Suddenly, Quint didn't feel so bad about setting him up. He jumped across the distance between where he was standing and the wall, landing on top of Philip and taking a hold of his head. He punched him square in the forehead, gently, and with his enhanced strength, it was more than enough to knock him unconscious. He dragged Philip off the wall and laid him down to rest next to it in a contorted position, surrounded by his drugs, then moved the wall halfway onto the assembly line, slightly bent the hook on the crane, and then stepped back to check his work. Perfect. When Jamie came in early tomorrow, he would see this and everything would make sense. Philip was a druggie who got himself injured after hours doing something he shouldn't have been doing with the crane. If he tried to convince Jamie that Quint was some sort of superhuman, all Jamie had to do was look at the joints found with him, and he would realize that Philip was high at the time of the incident. Quint could deny that he was even there, or probably closer to the truth. He would say that Philip came in for some reason and offered to do the after-shift work for him, to try to show him up, and then Quint left, and Philip had his accident. Either way, whatever Quint said would be believed, and Philip would do anything to avoid being accused of attempted murder. Once again, Quint was in the clear. He checked Philip's pulse and admired the huge coloring lump on his forehead. He was going to wake up with a really bad headache, and hopefully he would be out until morning. Either way, it wasn't Quint's problem anymore. He walked calmly to his old dark green pickup truck, pulling out his cell phone and hitting the speed dial button as he went. The beautiful feminine voice picked up almost immediately. "Quint?" "Hey, babe," Quint answered with a smile. "I'm on my way home. Got a shower before our night out, so I'll meet you at your place around 8-ish. Is that okay?" "Yeah, that's fine. How was work?" Quint sighed. "Well, I'll tell you all about it tonight over dinner." "Uh-oh, I know that tone of voice," she said. "Well, I'm all dressed up and sitting on my rear end, so hurry up, mister." "Yes, ma'am," Quint said with a smile.